Hello, everyone. Hi, it's Adebola speaking. Welcome to Analyze This Views from Home and Abroad, a Nigerian history podcast co hosted by me, Adebola Anoche, with the assistance of our scriptwriter and research assistant, Osas. So, this podcast is a unique initiative to explore Nigerian history from diverse local and global perspectives. So, join us for insightful analysis and engaging conversations that uncovers the stories shaping our understanding of the past and present. Okay, so let's delve right into it. If I were to mention a phrase, safe space, in a gathering of millennials and Gen Zs today, my audience will most likely associate it with an emotional, psychological, or mental support you receive from a person or a group that gives you the permission to let your guard down, be vulnerable and express yourself freely without fear of being judged, misconstrued, mocked, or worse, be dismissed. So as a result, we have terms like the person in my safe space, which is such a huge responsibility to bestow someone, especially when you consider the term within its proper context and how it has evolved over centuries to mean so many different things. Once upon a time, a safe space was simply that a secure, well-guarded location or terrain. To be safe in your space was to be secured from any form of attack.
Yeah, and it still means the same thing now. Like your safe space is a person, or in this case, persons whom you feel secure from any form of emotional, verbal, spiritual, psychological, and even physical attack. Yeah, so safe spaces are a significant contribution in establishing what defines us as individuals and as people. Which is why we say things like, show me your friends and I'll tell you who you are, because our friends usually are our safe spaces. And in essence, a definition of who we are. So in the same way that where we live, where we are born defines us. So as a guy from, J-Town boy, we're born in Jos, J-Town people, that's basically our identity and we wear it proudly. Because we are defined by our locations and our environment and essentially by our, safe spaces.
Okay, so this brings us to our focus today, a sequel to our March episode. Do you remember our March episode? You guys go back.
Yeah.
But first, we will be going delve deeper into pre-colonial Nigerian history, looking into one of the safest spaces that defined our past as people and their influence in shaping pre-colonial civilization.
Yeah, so guys, our last episode, we had an interesting conversation with Dr. Kyo, who's a Nigerian architect and professor in the US who has done a lot of work both in Nigeria and outside Nigeria. And please, if you've not listened to that episode, just press pause now and check our last episode.
While we won't be able to unpack all this that is involved in pre-colonial architecture, one thing that stands out is the fact that architectural expression is a language, frequently evolving into new forms, materials, and contracts to the characteristics of past styles or building concepts and techniques. So those that remain valid are carried into the present, while those that remain antiquated are dropped from use. In the same way that the evolution of language is defined, architecture is also another defining feature that distinguishes one era from another and or group of people from another. So behind each style or design is a reason that tells the story of how that structure came into existence and what it represents. So today, we are taking a closer look at the stories behind the walls that define us, the walls of Benin. Drum
Yeah,
roll.
yeah. That sounds pretty mystical, but yeah, that's what we'll be discussing today on the podcast, guys. So come along.
One thing that stood out in our previous episode is that human settlement patterns significantly influence the community's architecture and design. From this, we can understand that architectural designs are as diverse as the settlement patterns and social and ethnic characteristics of the people that create them. And when we flip the coin, we also see the power of architecture in shaping the social behavior of its creators. Looking at the walls of Benin for this episode, we will address how geographical and social factors influence the creation of this architectural wonder in pre-colonial Nigeria, and in turn, how it shaped the lives and stories of the people who built it. Essentially, the stories behind these walls.
Yeah. So yeah, we begin in 800 AD, basically. The stories behind the walls in Benin. It's sad, when you think about it, that when we think of Benin's artistic heritage today, the image that comes to our mind is, that bronze mask of Festac 1977, basically. Another thing that comes to mind when we think about Benin are the hundreds of stolen artworks that we are waiting for to be returned to us from different parts of the world. But beyond the excellent bronze sculptures, the walls of Benin are a significant heritage of the ancient Benin Empire, although unfortunately non-existent today. The walls of Benin for centuries were the pride and security of the Benin people. Essentially, the walls were their safe spaces, and that's why we started this conversation talking about safe spaces today.
Yeah. So a safe space indeed. But at first, to understand why this is a safe space, we have to understand what it is, right? So what was the Benin Empire?
So yeah, the Benin Empire was home to the Edo people who dominated the South Forest regions of Nigeria, or at least what is now called Nigeria. They're one of the oldest people groups in Nigeria, and one of the first to have had contact with the Europeans in the 16th century. But we cannot speak about the Benin people and their gallant walls without first of all looking at their very complicated origins, which is the story behind who they believe they are versus who people say they are. So our scriptwriter Osas decided to share her own personal story, basically. Yeah.
Hmm. Are you ready for this story, guys? So,
Yeah.
so Osas has a Yoruba mom and a Bini father, which is a very common couple combination despite contested origins between the two. According to Osas, her first history lessons were the oral traditions of Bini people, delivered by her father using the Tales by Moonlight lectures. Do you guys remember Tales by Moonlight?
Yeah, of course,
For
of
those who
course we do.
remember, you remember.
Yeah.
So she was taught by her father, a Bini man, that the history of the Bini people begins with the Ojiso dynasty, kings of the sky, a mystical lineage of demigods founded by Igodo, which is why Benin was previously called Igodemi Godo.
Igodo
Please,
Migodo.
please, for those who are Benin, please correct me. Go ahead and correct me. But I'm doing my best.
Yeah.
About 36 Ojisos ruled over the Edo people, with Owodo being the last of them. Owodo was succeeded by his son, Ekaladehan, but unfortunately for him, his mother's busybody led her to alter the message from the oracle to be delivered to the Ojiso Owodo. And as a result, Ekelhardahan was banished from Benin Kingdom. The banished prince then relocated temporarily to the neighboring kingdom of the Yorubas in Ile-Ife. Emphasis on temporary, please. Now I'm going to note something. In the Yoruba, I'm Yoruba. In the Yoruba land, this Elkahadahan at times is also ascribed to as Oduduwa. Um, but let's move on. Let's focus on what we're saying here. So coincidentally, the Yorubas at this point were kingless, essentially. But the oracle who sees all things had prophesied that a king would come to them out of the forests. Therefore, when Elkahadahan emerged from the thick forest from whence he had been banished, his arrival was the fulfillment of such anticipated prophecy. So, without wasting any time, the Yoruba people of Ife appointed him king. Now remember, Ekahadhan believed he would one day return to his home as king, and if anything, this was confirmation, and so he changed his name to Imadodua, meaning I did not misplace my royalty. Years passed, and Imadodua's father died, and the throne in Bini was left vacant. The only reason Imadodua was banished was as a consequence of his mother's actions, but he remained well loved by his people. So when Owodu died, a delegation of Edo chiefs, Uzomas, came to the Ile-Ife to ask Imadodua to return to Benin and assume his throne. Unfortunately, several years had passed, and Imadodua had developed a deep devotion to his new subjects, the Yorubas. I mean, they were kingless before he saved them. However, with his heart still tied to his home, he decided that one of his own ruling Benin was better than leaving the throne vacant and having a stranger occupied. So he sent one of his 7 sons, Oramiyan, to rule as king in his stead. The thing about life is that your safe space doesn't necessarily have to be your state of origin. It's simply the place where you feel most comfortable and familiar, which is most often place of our birth. Both, right? Do you think so?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. So back to the story, guys. So for Oramiya, which is one of the sons of Elkahadahan, or also known as Imadodua, although he went to Benin to rule, it wasn't his natural habitat or safe space, considering he was born and raised in Ife. So after some years, when his own son was old enough, he left Benin and returned to Ife, bequeathing his throne to his son, Eweka, who then became the first Oba of Benin, abandoning the Ojiso title. In Osas's opinion, Eweka caused the problem because if he didn't, there may not have been a second tradition of origin.
Yeah. So basically, the second tradition being the theory that is promoted majorly by the Yorubas. And so according to this version, the Ogisos ruled the Edo people quite all right, but at some point, the Ogisos began to do somehow, as we say, in broken English. And then the Edo people had become dissatisfied with the rule of the Ogisos, especially under Odo. To solve their leadership problem, they went to Ile-Ife to request that Oromia, who was the son of Oduduwa, who basically created the earth according to Yoruba folklore, the king of Ife, to come and rule over them. So they went to Ile-Ife and asked that the son of Oduduwa come to rule over them. And, like a consultant, sort of basically. But Oromia, who was preoccupied with ruling his own affairs, sent his son. He didn't come himself. Basically, he contracted the job to his son, Eweka, who now ruled as the first Oba of Benin, thereby officially ending the Ogiso dynasty and fixing Benin's problems.
So you see why Osas blames Eweka for being the root cause of the endless debate. Although some Yorubas will argue that it was Oramiyan himself who came to rule Benin, how could he? Imagine it. Tinubu will not stand up now and go and rule Niger Republic because they had a coup. Instead, he will appoint someone else to do so on his behalf, just like he has done in Rivers State.
Hmm.
And who better than his own son?
The whole issue of River States, I prefer not to speak because,
I don't know what to say.
there's Nigerian geopolitics right now is a mess. But, we'll move on. So yeah, contested traditions of origin aside, what we cannot contest is the continuous expansion, growth, and development of the Benin Empire, which was witnessed for as long as it lasted. So whether under the reign of the 36 Ogisos or Eweka or even Oromia, qualities were added to this ancient kingdom, making it the fortress and safe space that it is known for.
Okay, so the Benin Kingdom was indeed a safe space. In 1691, the Portuguese ship captain Lourenço Pinto observed that in Great Benin, the people live in such security that they have no doors to their houses. He also added that Great Benin, where the king resides, is larger than Lisbon. All the streets run straight as far as the eye can see. The houses are large, especially that of the king, which is richly decorated and has fine columns. Very excellent urban planning. The quality modern day Benin can uncomfortably not brag about.
That's crazy,
Sister Elu.
basically. So in 1691, the architecture and the quality of the planning of the city is better than what it is today. That's, you know, reminiscent of what Nigeria is basically. So creating a safe and secure space was very essential because if there's one thing the contested origin stories tell us, is that Benin had neighbors, and neighbors aren't always friendly. Some of us would know that. So the kingdom was already insulated by armed guards, solid gates that were locked at night. There was need for more protection from their adversaries like the Oyo Kingdom to the south, marauding slave raiders from Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries, and by the 18th century, the Sokoto Caliphate in the north. Therefore, as the threats that surrounded the Benin Kingdom increased, the walls went higher to keep enemies out. Think about the wall in Game of Thrones, for those of us who love Game of Thrones. And so they could freely move in and out of the kingdom to conduct trade, to farm, to have slave raids, military conquest, and diplomatic relations with their neighbors and the Europeans.
The walls of Benin stand out for their unique construction, consisting of extensive moats and ramparts. To paint a visual picture, the moats are essentially ditches dug around the exterior, creating a circumference around the ramparts. Were the moats made were the mounds made from the soil or laterite, dug out of the ditch moat. These ramparts were constructed in layers using the soil dug up from the moat mixed with palm oil and thatches. So the rampart varied in size. There are shallow traces to as high as 66 feet. This is important to note because in our last episode, we spoke a lot about sustainability in architecture. And one of these things Dr. Kyo advocated for was the use of indigenous materials in construction. The Wall of Benin remains notable because they utilized the materials in their immediate environment to create this stellar work of art. So, which should teach us that we don't have to import everything from roof sheets, the chandeliers, the solar panels to have the one in town buildings we strive for.
Yeah. So this is actually very important because this podcast is more than just about sharing ancient knowledge. It's about helping us and you see ways you can use that knowledge to inform your decision making centuries later. Basically, knowledge of the past helps shape the future. So it's rumored that during Nigeria's oil boom, which is the era after the Civil War, Nigerians imported everything, including sharp sand used for construction. The architects and the builders of the world of Benin would have rolled in their graves because they witnessed such a waste of resources.
So these walls, or the walls were built from clay, dug from their own soils. The Wall of Benin is said to be one of the lengthiest Asian fortifications in the world, which covered a border distance of about 16,000 kilometers, 16 square feet kilometers, and enclosed about 6,500 square kilometers of community land in a mosaic of more than 500 interconnecting settlements. Altogether, this was double the length of the Ming Great Wall of China, which measured 8,851 kilometers. This new official length of 21,196 kilometers was announced on June 5th, 2012, after the discovery of the Wall of Benin displaced the Great Wall of China under its old measurements.
Yeah.
The Herculean project, according to archaeological studies, estimates that construction of the Benin ramparts started around 800 AD and continued till the mid-1400s, credited with the initiating the multifaceted project. Oba Oguola, 1280 to 1295, directed the digging of the first and second moats and ordered the construction of 20 more moats around essentially towns and villages During this period, the kingdom was near its peak and was engaged in many wars, hence the need for more safe spaces. The 15th century, Oba Eware the Great, 1440 to 1473 MCE, was would expedite the process, extending the moat by about 3,200 kilometers and consolidating them by adding great thoroughfares and erecting 9 fortified gateways. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
so
That's a
it
lot.
was a Herculean project indeed. Um, it is estimated that its construction, if spread out over 5 dry seasons, would have required a workforce of 1,000 laborers working 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, which is massive for those of you who don't understand that scale. Excavations also uncovered that a rural network of earthen walls, 4 to 8,000 miles long, that would have taken an estimated 150 million man hours to build and must have taken hundreds of years to build. These were apparently thrown down to mark out territories for towns and cities. The very high walls were a nightmare to scale through. Attackers and invaders trying to climb over were target practice for Benin soldiers with their spears and poisoned arrows. The outer walls formed a thick shield around the city, and its 9 gates restricted access. It was heavily guarded around the clock and shut at night. It was a very safe space, essentially.
Hmm. I know we are giving the dimensions of the wall already, but how large is 16,000 kilometers?
In Nigeria, we aren't trained to understand distance in numerical measurements. We don't understand numerical measurements in general, whether it comes to
What does that mean?
distance or in money. So, for example, you would see somebody say one politician stole 80 billion naira, and they just say it casually. It's like we don't understand the magnitude of what 80 billion naira is and how much 80 billion naira can greatly improve the lives of the average Nigerian. We don't understand the magnitude of figures. It's the same way when somebody just says 16,000 kilometers. On average, we might not understand the gravitas, or rather the gravity that 16,000 kilometers is.
Okay, so in the case that this entire expanse of land, sea, and air stretching from the western shore of the Niger River and continuing through the west southwest in Ondo State and parts of Lagos Badagry in modern Nigeria, similar to contested traditions of origin depending on who you ask. Someone like Lanre Alayede will paint a picture of an even more extensive empire, which at its peak extended from Igbo Kingdom of Onitsha in the east of Nigeria through parts of the southwest region of Nigeria, modern-day Benin Republic, Togo, and into present-day nation of Ghana. The Ga people of Ghana trace their ancestry to the ancient kingdom of Benin. That's a story for another day, but yeah, that's another story entirely. Um, to all those Edo people hating Ghanaians for their jollof rice, be careful. This might just be your cousins.
Yeah, so basically, like we said, there's a lot more to that information, but maybe on future episodes we'll break it down. So we get the picture. It was a large empire surrounded by a very large wall that took centuries to build, and sadly took a lot less time, decades, to destroy.
Yeah, but before we get into the sad ending of the story, let's share some more amazing things, right? One major wow factor these walls had was that it essentially walls into walls, right? It's walls into walls. So within the moat and ramparts surrounding the kingdom, the heart of Benin City, the capital that housed very important abodes like the royal palace, the chiefs' houses, were enclosed in an inner wall about 10 kilometers long that was as high and wide as two-story buildings. Just everybody digest that for a little bit. Outside the wall was a deep ditch, another moat, as deep and wide as the wall. The inner wall had a massive gateway in addition to the 9 major entrances, made of wood and earth, that was heavily fortified and had a heavy wooden door. Travelers and merchants bringing goods into the city usually paid a toll before the gates were open and they were let in. This shows the multiple revenue sources that sustained the wealthy empire. The city was like an onion with multiple layers to it because, separate from the Oba's palace region, the upper parts of the city were where the Ozuama chiefs and army commanders lived. They were surrounded by high door-red outer walls with rooftops to prevent rain washing it away. It had a mighty thatched gate that was guarded by many soldiers, and any traveler passing through this gate must identify them himself before being let through.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the level of organization and civilization that existed within those walls when you compare it to the disorganization and chaos that we live in today as Nigerians. And this point is one of my serious problems with us as a country, because over the years, other civilizations improve, and yet we have found a way to regress. But yeah, one parallel we can draw from the pre-colonial kingdom and the Fourth Republic of Nigeria is that the capital city will always be where security is concentrated the most. Because of how difficult passing through these gates, both the inner and outer gates in those times was, most traders and merchants preferred to simply conduct their business outside of the capital. While for many foreign visitors, it took days before they were granted access and could see the king.
So the walls, the walls, to a great extent, also prevented the notorious European and African slave traders from their routine raids on towns and villages in search of slaves. These raids were common at that time, right? So this was critical because although Benin was a major slave trader, in fact, slave trade, internal and external, was one of the mainstay of their economy. Like crude oil. However, they were very protective of their people and only sold to the societal misfits, thieves, witches, murderers, etc. You guys can think about it. Out
Yeah,
in out in slavery, while they depended largely on their vassal and tributary state tribes for slaves.
yeah. So, what happened to the Great Walls of Benin? Why is it possible that a wall that huge, and for people who don't understand the magnitude of what we're talking about how these walls were layered and how extensive the architecture was. If you go online, there are certain models that you will see that people have done just to show the magnitude of what we're trying to talk about, and then you can have a picture. So, what happened to the Great Walls of Benin? Why is it possible that a wall that huge, and like we said, for those people who don't understand what we're talking about, go online and browse and see models of this structure and how layered these walls were, so that you understand how a 16,000-kilometer wall could have been structured in a place like Nigeria. You understand? So why is it possible that a wall that huge and long can remain unknown by millions of Nigerians? Not just that it's unknown worldwide, it's unknown by millions of Nigerians. When the Wall of China, which is basically half its estimated length, made it to the list of the 7 wonders of the world. Yeah. So basically, we are saying, why have our walls been forgotten? Eh? Why why don't they even exist anymore? Basically.
Honestly, that's a very good question. A great one indeed. That I hope our Ministry of Education, Ministry of Arts, Culture and Tourism, and the Creative Economy,
Hmm.
FMACCE, and the National Orientation Agency will take up seriously. So
Yeah.
if you're listening to this episode and you work in any of these sectors, please do something about it and reach out to us. We would love to hear your answers so we can also share with our listeners the good work you are doing. If you know anybody in these sectors, please share the podcast with them too. And even if you don't know, Biko, like, share, subscribe to our podcast. I beg you, please do.
Thank you very much.
Hmm. I don't have that. Thankfully, this is not one of these answers that you can blame the Nigerian government for, because this failure dates back to the time long before there was ever a thought of even creating a place called Nigeria. This disaster is to blame on the punitive expedition of 1897.
Yes, the infamous Benin Massacre of 1897, when British officers declared open season on our people's arts, lives, and livelihoods.
Mm.
Yeah.
A real tragedy with a complicated background. So essentially, the Benin had been trading with the Europeans, beginning with Portugal, since the 16th century, in items like palm oil, pepper, and slaves. However, by the 18th century, the global market shifted in favor of a new economic system where massive production of machines was prioritized over manual labor by slaves. Therefore, the growing demand of the Industrial Revolution, with a sprinkle of humanitarian and religious consciousness, led to the abolition of the slave trade, which was replaced by the legitimate trade, right? In this new economic system, the demand for raw materials like palm oil escalated, and Benin remained central to the trade. A giant and flourishing kingdom, courted by all Europeans trading in the region for the red oil that she controlled. And then the Berlin Conference happened, which ushered in the scramble for and partition of Africa. It was within the context of this scramble that the Great Walls of Benin came tumbling down.
Essentially, the Europeans were hustling to sign treaties that would validate their control over parts of Africa. And the sad part is that these treaties were signed by African rulers who had limited understanding of what they were committing themselves to. And in the instances where they resisted based on their understanding, they were forcefully subdued. The Europeans, especially the British, had the confidence to do this because they were driven by this manifest destiny ideology. I want people to check out what the manifest destiny ideology is, which was their belief in a divine right to expand and civilize the dark continent of Africa. So, rooted in their concept of racial superiority, a civilizing mission, and economic interest, the manifest destiny was used by Europeans to justify the colonization and exploitation of African territories and populations. Okay, so with his manifest destiny in mind and his treaty in hand, Henry Galway, the British Vice Consul of the Oil Rivers Protectorate, set out for Benin in 1892. His aim to open up trade and ultimately annex Benin Kingdom, which up to this point was an independent kingdom and enjoyed monopoly of trade in the region, which was a threat to the Royal Niger Company. If you remember our episode where we talked about the history of fast food in Nigeria, we spoke about Unilever. Royal Niger Company is basically the origins of Unilever. But anyway, their monopoly of trade in the region was a threat to Unilever, and his aim was to transform this Benin Kingdom into a British protectorate. Galway succeeded in getting Oba Ovorame, who ruled from 1888 to 1914, and his chiefs to sign a treaty which gave Britain legal justification for exerting greater influence over the empire. Of course, the Oba did not fully understand what he was conceding his sovereignty and monopoly to the British, because in typical manifest destiny fashion, the economic, racial superiority and expansionist motivations were hidden behind humanitarian expressions. So they made it look like they were, doing him a favor, and meanwhile there was a more sinister plan behind. So Galway's negotiation focused on trade agreements with the Oba to allow for free passage of goods through his territory and the development of the palm oil industry through a free trade agreement. Eventually, Galway got his treaty signed and skipped away.
But it was one thing to have the treaty signed on paper and another to have it implemented. As expected, the Oba continued to exercise his monopoly, as was his right? Which
Yeah.
made Ralph Moore, High Commissioner of the Southern Protectorate, compel the Foreign Office to use whatever means to secure the signed treaty, up to and including force. Essentially, This non-consensual treaty gave Britain legal justification for exerting greater influence in the region, again because of the influence of Manifest Destiny. The reports of the British consul Richard Burton, who visited Benin in 1862, even before Galway, had described it as a place of gratuitous barbarity, which stinks of death. Can you believe?
Hmm.
That's a far cry
Gratuitous
from what we are
barbarity.
talking about, the walls and all that. Okay,
Exactly. So
okay.
they already
Or the Portuguese
saw us as
pinto.
exactly saw us as animals, even in ways that did not reflect what was actually going on. And
Exactly.
but yeah, continue, please.
Then this narrative was publicized in Britain and increased pressure for the for the territories' incorporation into the British Empire, under the pretext of ensuring the general progress of civilization. In 1894, after the capture of Ebrohimi, the trading town of the chief Nana Olomu, the leading Ishakiri trader of the Benin River district, by the combined Royal Navy and Niger Coast Protectorate Force, the Kingdom of Benin increased the military presence on its own southern borders. Of course, it was expected, considering its long-standing record of defending its people. At this point, permission had not yet been granted by the Colonial Office for the invasion of Benin City. Hmm.
So that's interesting because even without permission, there were three separate attempts that were made between September 1895 and mid 1896 by the Protectorate to enforce the Galway Treaty of 1892. In March 1896, following price fixing and refusals by Ishekiri middlemen to pay the required tribute, the Oba of Benin ordered the cessation of the supply of oil palm produce to them. The trade embargo brought trade in the Benin River region to a standstill, which was not good for British business. So British merchants in the region appealed to the Protectorate Consul General to open up Benin territories and send the Oba into exile. In October 1896, the acting Consul General James Robert Phillips visited the Benin River district and met with agents and traders who convinced him that there is a future on the Benin River if Benin territories were opened. So it was basically because they wanted, the resources that the Benin Kingdom controlled.
Hmm. These negotiations sound a lot like the scenario playing out in the global economy right now.
Yes, it does. But yeah, so confident in reports from the traders, Phillips felt it was time to meet the man he had heard so much of about. And in November 1896, Phillips decided to meet with the Oba to address failures in fulfilling the terms of the treaty. He formally asked his superiors in London for permission to visit Benin City, claiming that the cost of such an embassy would be recouped by trading of ivory.
Hmm. So, what Phillips was doing here was trying to proffer a solution. So, for all these years, the Foreign Office in London had not approved the request for the use of force because it was expensive, right? War is never cheap, right? And the aim of the British government was to make money from the region while spending the barest minimal in the process, which is why they always used treaties and missionaries as their plan A and only resorted to the use of force when they had exhausted other options. But here was Phillips saying, I know say money na una problem. That's now why I get better plan. We go guarantee una sure ROI, right? The plan
Yeah,
being the lucrative ivory trade, a resource Benin had in abundance. For those
yeah,
who are pidgin speakers, please forgive my intonation.
yeah.
Ah,
Anyway, but you did well. You did well. So this is why I always, how you just mentioned how they use treaties and missionaries, with the bringing of Christianity to Africa. As Christians, a lot of times we conflate what the gospel is and what the white man did. They didn't bring Christianity to spread the love of Jesus to this continent. No, they brought it as a tool to subjugate us, but that is a topic for another day. Anyway, I think Philip's plan would have
Yeah.
worked if his overconfidence and pepper body didn't get in the way. Because instead of patiently waiting for approval, he rushed in late in December 1896 to embark on an expedition with an entourage of 18 officials, including local interpreters, 180 jack reporters to carry their supplies, and 60 crew laborers. I want to point out something that is not in our story for today, but it basically says that, or it occurs to me that we can't be defeated or be taken advantage of by foreign entities without the help of locals.
Mm-hmm.
So people just like us who are basically helping those who aim to subjugate us, because just the British alone would not have been able to do the things that they did. They had to have had help from locals just like us. And it says out our culture of selling each other out, and why we need to improve on that basically. But please go ahead.
We're not nice. We're not nice to one another.
We are not. We really are not.
Mm.
Okay.
So Phillips had sent a message to the Oba claiming that his present mission was to discuss trade and peace and demanding admission to the territory. He had also acted like Jacob, traveling to meet Esau by sending ahead an envoy. Remember, guys, Bible
Yeah.
people?
Yeah, we do.
Bearing numerous gifts for trade. However, this was the period of the Igwe Festival, an annual event in Benin, celebrated for 7 days between Christmas and New Year, which the Oba blesses the land and its people. Now, there is a major disclaimer for this period that states the Oba is prohibited from being in the presence of any non-native person. In adherence to the culture of his land, Oba Ovoramwen sent word that he had not wished to see the British at the time, and he would send word in a month or two when he was ready to receive Just Phillips and one Jackery chief. I mean, even if I was the one and I heard you were coming to see me with all these people, I'll refuse.
Yeah, but you see, Phillips, like we said, he had busybody, and he trust too much. So rather than wait, he went ahead with his entourage. A consistent theme in the history we have narrated in this episode is that the story depends on who you ask. We mentioned it earlier with the origins of, both the Yoruba side and the Benin side. And in this story too, you also find that there was an English side and then the Benin side. So the story depends on who you ask. So if you were to ask the British accounts, you'll be told that on 4th January 1897, Phillips and his entire party were ambushed along their journey to this Benin city at Ugbini village near Guato. British officers and African porters were slaughtered. Only 2 British survived their wounds, Alon Bosraigon and Ralph Locke. The Edo ambushers captured over 100 Isheki reporters hired by the British and imprisoned them in Benin. But if you ask the indigenous accounts by the Benin people, the narrative is that on 4th of January 1897, still within the period of the Igwe Festival, James Phillips led a British team accompanied by 250 local soldiers who were masquerading as porters and a band, hiding weapons in their baggage. The group journeyed into Benin from the port town of Ouarton to face the king to abolish custom duties on trade with Europeans. Warned by the locals that the king was forbidden by custom to receive foreign visitors during the period, the party pressed on. Unfortunately, the Benin Army's attempt to stop the British encroachment led to the tragic event that became known as the Benin Massacre, and I put that in quotes. All but 2 of the officials survived the ambush at Ugbini.
So disparities aside, both accounts tell an equally tragic event, right? So We saw the
Yeah,
end, the demise.
yeah.
The,
So one thing is clear, however, war with the British became inevitable, and the reprisal came remarkably swift. It was like they were waiting for the opportunity. Within the week, news of the massacre had reached the Foreign Office in London, and with um, with everything government related, they launched a fire brigade approach, now granting swift approval for the request to forcefully subdue the Oba and his people. The authorized military action leading to what is known as the Punitive Expedition. The purported intention by Colonel Moore, who had stated it is imperative that a most severe lesson be given the kings, chiefs, and juju men, all of all surrounding countries, that white man cannot be killed with impunity, and that human sacrifices with the oppression of the weak and poor must cease. So you are coming to fight oppression with guns. That is the theme of what they were saying. The white man cannot be killed with impunity. So, and if you notice, there was a tone of them, referring to us and our activities as barbaric and barbarians, basically, and they were coming to help us. That's what the idea was. So with this, a punitive expedition was executed when British soldiers launched a three-pronged attack on Benin the following month, looting its royal treasury, setting the city ablaze, cutting away priceless cultural artifacts, and exiling the king. And it's important to note that this is the real massacre, the real Benin massacre.
this is really, yeah. This was truly the real massacre of Benin people, their king and their heritage, the burnt walls and the looted artifacts. This was the beginning of over 500 years of building and 150 million hours of work. And over the
Oh,
years, the conditions have continued to deteriorate to the point where only fragments of the wall remain scattered over Benin in isolated positions. You know what you know that saying, right? The walls have ears. And the rhetorical question, if these walls could speak, what will it say? What would it say about the people whose hard work built it throughout their lives? And what would it say about the events that tore it down and sacked its city, erasing the safety that it once provided, reducing it to just space?
yeah. It's also important to note that, like I said, the British couldn't have done this without the help of locals. Secondly, they came with guns. Okay, we could not fight back because we didn't have guns, so they came with weapons. Anyway, modern urban planning continues to take away from the walls and erase the city's cultural and architectural heritage, which is something that pains me. A modern design inspires as modern design inspires an influx of foreign construction materials, indigenous techniques and resources are gradually being pushed out in favor of the former. And this answers the question: why have the walls been forgotten? It's a combined effort, both by the fact that they were destroyed by the punitive expedition and that Nigerians have abandoned it afterwards. We've not tried to preserve it. We've not tried to maintain the techniques that were used to create those walls in the first place.
Okay, so how sad, right? But thankfully, all hope isn't lost because located in Benin's dense forest is the Museum of West African Art, MOWAA, a sanctuary for those who haven't had hope in African heritage. So MOWAA is dedicated to the preservation of heritage, expansion of knowledge, and celebration of West African arts and culture. And the reason why we are giving MOWAA their well-deserved flowers on this episode is because the footprint of the MOWAA campus is in the heart of the historic core of Benin City and is mounded by the ruins of the ancient empire's earthen wall monuments. Institutions like MOWAA intentionally choose to acknowledge Nigerian heritage and create avenues to expand on it.
Yeah, sure.
MOWAA is also very sustainable driven, which, as we emphasized in our previous episode, must be brought to the forefront of all our architecture and design work. If you are a historian, an archaeologist, artisan, designer, researcher, or sustainability enthusiast, you will find MOWAA's website to be a breath of fresh air. And I believe their campus offers a safe space for you too.
Yeah, so thankfully, through podcasts like this, institutions like MOA or MOWAA, the stories behind the walls that make us will continue to be told. Stories beyond the massacres and the punitive expeditions. Stories that tell of the safe spaces that we had, like Benin. So Benin, like several parts of Nigeria once were. Um, so, um, where ritual killings, herder farmer clashes, and banditries were once alien terms. Okay, this, things like this never happened, at least the way they're happening now. On the 29th of March 2025, 16 hunters were reported to have been massacred in Uromi in Edo State. And as with every narrative from this episode today, the story depends on who you ask. The point is, whether it's in Edo State, in Plateau State, in Borno State, or in Kaduna State, the massacres, the killing, it needs to stop. We need to restore the safety of our spaces, our villages where our food is produced, our highways where people can't afford to fly and travel, our markets where we exchange things amongst ourselves, our forests which are supposed to be preserved, our towns, our schools, and our worship centers. Our actions or inactions today will make the history books tomorrow. So let's do our best to write those pages well and not allow the test of our brothers' bloods ruin the stories of our generation.
This is a lot said. I know it's a lot to take in. We went from discussing the origins of the Yoruba, the Benin people, in connection with the Benin people and Ile-Ife. Then we went on to the walls, and then from there, the demise and what is being done by different organizations such as MOWAA. So thank you so much again for listening. Shout out to our team, Osas, our scriptwriter, Noche,
Osas, you did a fantastic
my co-host,
job.
and myself, Adibola. Remember to subscribe and follow us on all platforms: YouTube, Instagram, Apple, AfriPod, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Audible. And for now, we say bye.
Bye, guys. Bye, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you.